I'm really glad you reminded me. Um, uh, is that Mamie? How do you pronounce your name?
It's Mame.
Mame? Okay, Mame, thank you so much. I
No
am at
problem.
times the absent-minded professor. That's part of my job description, the absent-minded professor. So I always want to record the lecture from the beginning and have now got the recording turned on. So it will be processed and uploaded to Blackboard, okay? And I really do appreciate the reminder because I'm quite capable of forgetting to turn it on. So here we go. We had a productive lecture on Monday where we covered the first meditation of Descartes. And as I say, I'm not tracking. There were so many hundreds of people, I can't track attendance, but I know some of you were there and many others from other sections. And there were some really good questions being asked. We had a good discussion and we covered the first meditation. And today, yeah, it's being recorded, Joel. And today, I'm going to cover with you the second meditation of Descartes, which is really a continuation of the first. And then we'll see more or less what Descartes' real main point is as far as we're concerned about his epistemology and his ontology. We're going to get a pretty much a clearer handle on where Descartes' meditations lead him. And then we'll stop there with Descartes. And next week, we'll continue with an empiricist to contrast with the rationalist, which Descartes is. We're going to look at a very radical empiricist by contrast named Berkeley. And toward the end of today's lecture, I will show you the upload, which is in your Google Drive folders, just so you'll know the name and know what you need to read for next Monday. Again, Monday's a holiday, so you don't have to show up. I am going to show up and lecture whoever's in the room and record that as usual on Zoom, so you'll be able to view the lecture at your convenience next week, okay? That's our game plan. So, are there any questions about what we covered in Meditation 1 of René Descartes? Before we go on to 2, which we're going to do momentarily, are there any questions about Meditation 1? If so, please enter them in the chat room or just speak out loud.
Sorry, I think I had a question.
Please.
There's a part that he talks about my judgment will no longer be dominated by bad usage. I wrote that down, but I can look it up here.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know. I guess I was a little confused because he kept bringing up this devil character and then like the senses, but aren't like the senses you're not supposed to use them as like a group thing? Like you can't trust your nose. Like if you're smelling something and it's not there, but you open your eyes and you see it's not there, then like you use your senses in conjunction. I feel like he was being deceived by his senses because he was trying to single them out.
Yes, well, he's saying, I mean, it is a complicated story, but what he's basically saying is that he can't trust any of them individually, and nor can he really use one sense to corroborate what the other one is telling him. So he's rejecting all of them. He's rejecting them individually as being reliable, and so he's also rejecting the combination of senses as being reliable. Okay, he's rejecting all the senses as being uncertain, and therefore he will take them. Remember, in his plan, anything that's uncertain will count as false, okay? So he's rejecting everything from the senses, whether it's individually or collectively. The bit about the devil, don't get too bogged down in that. He's being very careful here because just to put it in context, he's doing what we call a thought experiment, right? He's not saying there is some devil who's misleading me. He's saying just imagine for a second that there were some that God is not in charge, and imagine that there's some powerful demon, not as powerful as God, but some demon who's able to deceive us. And that demon is deceiving me into believing that I actually have a body when maybe I don't, and deceiving me into thinking that I'm looking out at the world and maybe that world doesn't even exist. And how would I know the difference, right? Like the Matrix, yeah, which came like 400 years later, but he's anticipating that. So he's saying this for the sake of argument. And he's being very careful when he talks about this hypothetical demon because he doesn't want the authorities of the day to misinterpret what he's saying. and to undermine, to believe. Okay, that's the political subtext, all right? Because at this time he could have gotten himself into huge trouble with the Inquisition if he had phrased this in a way which could have been interpreted as rejecting a belief in God. So he's very careful. He's walking on eggshells. He knows it. He's being a very courageous philosopher to challenge the evidence of the senses, but he's also being very politically careful not to land himself in a lot of trouble with the Inquisition. Is that clear? Okay. All right. You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So let's go on to the second meditation. I have it open here. Just let me share the screen with you, and we'll pull that up momentarily. As usual, I need to do everything in the right sequence. Share screen. And where is it? I'm not seeing it as usual. Chrome tab. Ah, there it is. All right, hopefully this works. You can see this, right?
Yes, you can.
Thank you very much. All right, so meditation 2. He begins by telling us all how depressed he is. His yesterday's meditation, he says, has hurled me into doubts so great I can neither ignore them nor think my way out of them. I'm in turmoil. He's really managed to confuse himself and to bring himself into turmoil, and he's very upset by his own thoughts now because he realizes there's almost nothing that he can really believe or know for sure. Right? Remember, that was the first task, yes, in meditation 1, to figure out what if anything he can really know to be true. And now he realizes that his own doubt has led him to a position where he doesn't know what he can believe anymore, which is a very discomforting thing. Okay. Especially for a philosopher. So he says, I suppose then, to continue from his path of the first meditation, I suppose then he says that everything I see is unreal. I mean, that's the default now. He can't believe his senses, so everything's unreal. I believe that none of what my unreliable memory presents to me ever happened. So, if the senses are unreal, connect the dots here. If your senses are unreliable, then not only is what you're seeing in the moment unreliable, but also everything you remember is unreliable. Yeah, we can't rely on our memory either, because what's our memory? Our memory is somehow a storage of all the past things that we've perceived, is it not? As well as thought. But you can, if you're remembering what you had for breakfast this morning, then you're remembering what your senses told you, right? You with me?
Yeah.
So if therefore your senses are unreliable, then also our memories are unreliable. And by the way, we know this to be true, right? Memory is very unreliable in any case. Never mind adding Descartes' skepticism. So he doesn't believe his senses are reliable. His memory he really can't believe his memory. If you want to see a really good movie about that, on the memory side, it's pretty old now. There may be some newer ones, but there was a movie called Total Recall. Does anybody remember that movie, Total Recall?
No, I never heard it.
Good. I've actually seen a movie you guys haven't seen. That's because I'm old school. Total Recall is probably about 20 or 30 years old, and it features the Governator, Arnold. Arnold is in that movie, okay? And it's some kind of sci-fi thing about Mars. But the premise of the movie, I'm telling you, to relate it to what Descartes is saying, the premise of the movie is this, that they figured out a way, this is science fiction, right? So it's a future setting, and they figured out a way to implant memories in people. And so they've turned it into an industry, this being the USA, of course, everything's an industry. So they figured out if you can't afford to go to Hawaii, I mean, it's expensive to go to Hawaii, right? Take a nice vacation in Hawaii, costs a few dollars. So, but they figured out how to implant the memory. So you go to this office, and they put you to sleep, and they implant this memory in your brain. They implant a little chip somewhere with an interface with your Hawaiian vacation, and then they put you in a suntan booth, and then you wake up, and you're wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and you have this memory. You say, oh, I just came back from Hawaii. And I mean, it's very funny, right? But it's also very true that what would be the difference between having a memory of everything you did in Hawaii and actually having been to Hawaii? The premise is there's no difference. If you have that memory, then you can't tell whether it really happened to you or not, right?
Yeah.
So memories can be tricky things, because we could fail to remember something that did happen, or we could also succeed in remembering something that didn't happen. And that's a big legal issue. Some of you may be aware of this, that in court now there's a false memory recovery issues, people who are being led to believe that certain things happened to them which maybe didn't, and then they testify in court that something happened and maybe it didn't. It's causing a lot of problems in the legal system too, because we rely on witnesses. Our system relies on testimony, but we also rely on true testimony. So people might be giving false testimony and not knowing it because of the memory thing. So, okay. So anyway, what is true, Descartes wants to know. Perhaps, what is true? Perhaps only that nothing is certain. So this is the kind of extreme position he's now led himself to, that perhaps nothing is certain. This is also a paradox. I want to stop here for a moment. In part 3 of the course, we're going to look at puzzles and paradoxes. A paradox is technically, a paradox is a kind of puzzle, and a paradox means, for those of you who may want to know the technical meaning of a paradox, it means a conclusion that we reach from premises, from an argument that seems very reasonable, like we lay out an argument that sounds like a very reasonable argument, and then we reach a conclusion from it which is somehow impossible or ridiculous. So we know we went wrong somewhere in our reasoning, but we can't figure out where. That's what is a paradox. We know there's something wrong with the conclusion, but we don't understand exactly what was wrong with the way that we reached it. And so it's our challenge to use our minds, the powers of our minds, to disentangle that problem and solve it. So when he says that only that nothing is certain, to assert that nothing is certain is a paradoxical assertion. Because think about it, okay? If nothing is certain, then it's also uncertain that nothing is certain. If nothing is certain, I'll say it a different way. If nothing is certain, then everything is uncertain, right? But if everything is uncertain, then so is the assertion that nothing is certain. So if nothing is certain, then it's actually uncertain that nothing is certain. And so if it's uncertain that nothing is certain, then something might be certain. Okay, I'm glad somebody gets this. It means your neurons are firing this morning. Okay, so it's a paradox. If you assert that nothing is certain, then you're really saying, well, then it's possible that something is certain, which seems like a contradiction, right? But that's what's paradoxical about it. That's what we call a paradox. There are many such paradoxes in philosophy. And I'll just come back to the class now. I see some comments, so let me come back to the class. LOL. Good. I'm glad you're laughing. All right. That's this is the only thing certain is uncertainty. Well, yeah, but that's exactly right, Nivriti. If the only thing certain is uncertainty, then that's certainly a paradox. Okay. Because it's a self-contradiction, yeah, in a certain sense. It's a logical paradox. It contradicts itself. Okay. Can you also now still see the screen, by the way?
Yeah.
Good. So I've accidentally done something good here. I mean, I always know how to do this, but I forgot. So I can now talk to you and see your comments, and we can hopefully continue reading. I don't know what will happen on the next page, but okay. So that's that part. I have to go back to change the page, which I'm going to do now. And then I'll try and bounce back here. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next page in the reader, and come to this very interesting assertion that he is led to. Let me try and come back to the room with this. Okay, so he's now realizing something else about his existence and something now that will become certain to him. He says, for as long as I think, for it may be that if I completely stop thinking, I would also cease to be. Well, that's interesting, right? So, how does he exist? In what way does he exist? He exists while he thinks. And if he says, if I completely stop thinking, I would also cease to be. Let me ask you this question. If you're in a really, really deep sleep at night, hopefully you do experience those deep sleeps with no dreams, that deep state of sleep with no dreaming going on, no consciousness going on. When you're in that state of very deep sleep, you're not consciously thinking of anything, right? You're not aware that you're thinking, correct?
I mean, yeah, technically, no.
Correct.
Okay, so then you're not aware that you exist either, yeah?
No.
We're only aware that we exist when we're dreaming, or when we start to come out of sleep, and then we start to wake up and figure what we have to do and whatnot. Then we start obviously aware of our existence. But if we're really technically not thinking, if the brain is like conscious brain is shut down to the extent that we're not thinking, then it's also true that we're not aware of our existence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's true.
Someone else could be. Obviously, someone else could be in the room and saying, well, you exist, you're just in a deep sleep, obviously, but for ourselves, we wouldn't know. And Descartes is really thinking now all alone. So, for him, for his own purposes, if he stopped thinking, he'd stop to be. But he says, I'm not now admitting anything unless it must be true. I'm therefore not admitting that I am anything at all other than a thinking being, right? A mind, soul, understanding, a thinking being, not an embodied being, a mind, soul, understanding, or reason. Terms whose meaning I did not previously know. Okay, we'll get to you in a minute, Mame. I know that I am a real existing thing, but what kind of thing? As I've said, a thing that thinks. This is where the dualism emerges. He's not sure about his body. I mean, he can sense his body, but he's not convinced about the senses, so they could be deceiving him, like in the Matrix. So he's not sure he has a body, but he's really sure he has a mind. He's a thinking thing, as opposed to an embodied being. And that's a big, big difference. Is there a question about this?
No.
Let me page again. So now you see, remember I talked about substance dualism, right, for Descartes? Substance dualism. That's Descartes' ontology. What happened? I lost the page here. Substance dualism. There is mind and matter, right? Those are the two things, or mind and body, if you like. Those are the two things for Descartes that exist. And he's not really sure about body at all, but he is sure about mind. And, if there's anything else out there, it may well be physical stuff. But the only thing he can really be sure about, as we're getting closer to seeing, is the mental stuff. He's very convinced, as we can all be convinced. In your own minds, you can all be convinced of your existence just by thinking about it. You know that you're thinking, and therefore there must be something there that thinks. Whereas when you look in the mirror and see yourself, you can't be sure. If you're a very radical skeptic like he is, you might think that's a physical hallucination, but you're much more sure that it's not a mental hallucination when you think that you exist, rather than when you see yourself. All right. So that's the main thing.
Sorry.
He says, yeah, question?
Is that when he says, I cannot prevent myself from thinking that corporeal things whose image are framed by thought are much more distinctly known than the obscure part of me which does not come under my imagination? Like, is he talking about like his soul and his mind and like what's outside his body?
Yes, talking about his mind. I mean, he thinks that we know at the end of the day, he actually believes that we know our minds much better than we know our bodies. There's so much that we don't know about our bodies, and even there's so much that we don't understand about our bodies, and so many mysterious things. People who lose limbs still feel phantom pain. You know this? People who are having. I mean, if and they know that. You mean your arm's not? Let's say your arm's not there, your leg's not there. It's been amputated. How could it possibly hurt, right? If it's not there. So that's in the mind too, but pain is not in the brain, because the brain doesn't feel pain. It's a very strange business. But basically, our body plays all kinds of tricks on us, and we don't really understand how it works, and we don't even need to know how the autonomic system the autonomic nervous system. Thank goodness the ANS works without us knowing how. I mean, our hearts beat. We don't have to control that. You know, our blood circulates. We don't have to control that. You know, we release all kinds of hormones and enzymes and all kinds of things that our body's doing for us we don't have to control. So we can't know. There's a lot of things we just can't know about our bodies. And we need some other, you know, tests done to figure them out sometimes. But as far as the mind is concerned, you can explore your mind pretty well and know what's in your mind. Now, that's what Descartes thinks. If you fast forward this a couple hundred years, well, more than that, you fast forward 300 years to the time of Freud and the heyday of psychoanalysis, it's literally 300 years after this that Freud is writing. And so Freud is the one who tells us that the conscious part of mind, the part Descartes is discussing, is only the tip of the iceberg, right? That in fact, according to Freud, there's a much bigger chunk of our own minds which is not known to us. And Freud called that what?
The subconscious, no?
The unconscious.
Unconscious.
Right? And he thought, and maybe about physical stuff, so we can't really draw it on a map or put it on a scale. But Freud thought that most of mental activity is not activity we're actually conscious of.
Yeah.
And that we have this big unconscious, and that's where our dreams come. And that's why he put so much stake in the interpretation of dreams, as do many people since that time and before that time in other cultures. Dreams were always thought to be very significant. Yes, in the ancient world, dreams were thought to be very significant. So you get scripture talking about dreams and the importance of dreams. But basically, dreaming takes place not in a conscious way. Dreaming is something that we observe. It's like we're watching a movie that we made, yeah? If you're dreaming, what are you doing? Your sort of conscious mind is sleeping, but awake and awake enough to watch your dream in a sense, right? Or to be in your dream. It's not something it's producing, it's being produced at deeper levels. That's what Freud thought anyway. So Descartes is also disputable. Here you could say, well, in light of modern psychology, maybe we don't know our minds as well as Descartes thought we did. But, you know, for the sake of argument, we know our minds better than we know our bodies. That's what Descartes' main point is here. All right, let's go on. I have to turn the page again, and I shall do so. Okay. I must have skipped it. It's jumping here a little bit. There. Now we get to this very important. I'm going to try and scale this also so I can get the whole text on the page. Can't quite do it. All right, I'll try that and display that for you. It's a bit small. Can I blow this? No. But hopefully you can read this. Problem is I can't read it. It's too small for me. So I'm gonna blow it up again and redisplay it. I'll just have to jump because I can't get it all on the screen from the top of one page to the top of the other page. Okay. So I'm gonna, before I display it to all of you, I'll just read the bottom of that column. Their thinking and thought alone cannot be taken away from me. Okay, so in other words, he can't be deceived into thinking that he's thinking, because then he's still thinking. So thought really belongs to him. I exist. That much is certain. So for him, he's finally now found something that he can take to be certain, namely that he exists. But he exists because he thinks, and that's all that he can say for sure in his world now. For as long as I think, he said, for maybe that if I completely stop thinking, it all ceases to be, right? But as long as he's thinking, he exists. And I am not now admitting anything unless it must be true, and I'm therefore not admitting that I'm anything at all other than a thinking thing. He's not saying I have a body. He's saying I am a thinking thing. That is a mind, soul, understanding, or reason. This is meaning I did not previously know. I know that I am a real existing thing, but what kind of thing? A thing that thinks. That's really the important statement. And it's from here we get this famous sort of bumper sticker, I think, therefore I exist, right? Or I think, therefore I am. And that's where you get the reasoning from Descartes that leads him to that position. I think, therefore I am, or I think, therefore I exist. Let me just turn the page now. Okay. And here's a very interesting and provocative argument in support of one of the faculties of mind. I'm going to come back to you now. You can all see this page, right? We're on a new page now. Everyone can see this, yes?
Yes,
Somebody?
we can.
Yeah, okay, thank you. All right. So we're going to come around now to the latter part of this meditation. And he's in the process of introducing a very important word that we're going to be focused on for this whole segment of the course, the next 4 readings that we do as well, one way or another, and particularly toward the end, are going to be focused on this word. I won't say the word yet, but we'll let Descartes come up with it, and then we'll think about why. He's going to ask us to conduct kind of an experiment with him. Now, he can do this in the room he's in, and we can all imagine doing it in our own rooms too. He says, take, for example, this piece of wax. All right. He's got a piece of wax on his desk. And he says it's just been taken from the honeycomb. It hasn't yet completely lost that beautiful odor. I don't know if you know, the fresh wax still has the odor of flowers on it. When the bees make wax for their honeycombs, their wax is very fragrant also, not just the honey. The wax still has some very beautiful fragrance, and it dissipates, over time. But if you've ever worked with bees, and I have, and you take wax from the comb, it's from the hive, it's very fragrant as well. So anyway, he picks up a piece of wax. Why, by the way, why would he have a piece of wax on his desk? Any thoughts?
From the candle that he's writing?
Candles would definitely be a use for. Remember, this is way before electricity. So since he's already told us he likes to stay up all night and write, he definitely needs candlelight, right? That's the only light source that he could conceivably read and write by. So he would have wax lying around, because they were making their own candles too. I mean, they would all keep in the country. They'd be keeping bees, or they would know a beekeeper, and that's where they'd get their wax for candles. So he's using candles for light, yes. Wax for light. What else? Any other ideas? Eraser. A good guess. I'm not so sure. I think they had rubber to erase, and ink would not be easily erased. I'm not sure if they used wax as an eraser. It seems to me if you wax the paper, you just end up with wax paper. For seals, yes, Melody, that's exactly right. They used to seal their letters. In the old days, everything was very personalized. Paper was very beautiful. It was handmade paper and handmade envelopes, and they would all customize their letters with a seal, as they do in China today. Still, they have a seal, and they have sealing wax. So when they wanted to seal an envelope, they would basically melt some wax, pour it on the envelope, and then they would across the flap, and then they would push their seal into it, so everybody would know that it came from that person, because the seal would be their personal seal. And also, you can't steam that open. Nobody could, you can't break the seal without people knowing that you'd broken the seal. So the seal is also a way of, I guess, protecting the letter against being somehow hacked. All right. So he had this lump of wax. Anyway, so he picks up this lump of wax from his desk, and he says it still has the scent of the flowers. And he says its color, shape, and size are obvious. It's hard, cold, and easy to touch. He says it makes a sound when wrapped. If you thump it with your finger, it makes a little, like a solid kind of a thunking sound. In short, he says everything required for me to have distinct knowledge of the physical object seems to be present, right? So he's now telling us that he's taking in all these data about the wax, and his senses are all telling him in each in its own way something about this wax. Now, here's what happens. As I speak, he says, I move the wax toward the fire. And what happens when he does that? Well, it's going to change, right? As he approaches the fire, maybe he puts it in a container, or maybe he just brings it closer to the fire and holds it in his hand. It loses what was left of its taste, right? It's going to change its chemical composition, its physical composition. It gives up its smell because whatever was, yes, physical change, Zane, and also chemical change, because the odor will evaporate. The heat will cause whatever fragrance there was on the surface to evaporate. So it's going to give up its smell. It changes color. As wax melts, it will change color as it goes from solid to liquid state, because it's a dye, right? If it's colored, and even if it's natural, it will become clear. Yeah, it's yellowish in its natural state, but if you melt natural wax, it will, as a liquid, actually become more clear, more watery. So it's going to change its smell, changes its color, obviously changes its shape as it starts to melt. It gets softer, and it goes from solid to liquid phase. So it changes its color, its smell, its shape. It gets bigger because it expands as it melts. It melts, it heats up, it becomes obviously warmer. It becomes difficult to touch, well, because it's hot, and it eventually is liquid. It will not burn you, but it will feel uncomfortable if you stick your finger in liquid wax. And it no longer makes a sound when struck because it's a liquid, not a solid. So now he asks a really good philosophical question. Is it still the same piece of wax?
I mean, yeah, just change its form. One that he grabbed before, like.
Right. Yeah. Most of you are saying yes. And I think that Descartes is also saying yes. I think that's the answer that intuitively we want to give. It's still the same piece of wax. Well, Descartes' answer to the question is we must say that it is. No one denies or thinks otherwise. Sure, it's the same piece of wax. But then comes a really interesting question. If we're willing to go along with that and say that it's the same piece of wax, but then what is it about the wax that allows you to conclude that? Because everything that you learned from the senses about that piece of wax has now changed. What you're calling the same piece of wax no longer has the same shape, the same odor, the same color, the same feel, the same, everything about it has changed that we would learn from our five senses. So how then? That's right, Ramon. This is where he's concocted this argument to demonstrate the senses are unreliable, because on the one hand, what are we doing? We're saying it's the same, but on the other hand, we're saying, but all the information from the senses is telling us that it's not the same. So with which part of our beings are we concluding that it's the same? This is where his argument is going, okay? So certainly he says nothing that I reached with the senses, no conclusion that I reached with the senses can be telling me it's the same, because the senses are all telling me that it's different, right? And yet I also know at one and the same time that it's the same piece of wax. And we're not talking about its utility, Mame. We're talking about how is it that we know it's the same piece of wax, although everything physical about it has changed. Close, Emily. Good guess. That's very close. And memory is part of mind, right? So we're getting to this rationalist position that in Descartes' view, it's not exactly memory, but I think that's a very important component. I think you're on exactly the right track by asserting that it's memory. Wouldn't our sight show us that it's the same? No. As Descartes, Sophina, for Descartes, the shape of the wax is totally changed. So it was first a solid shape and a very specific shape, and now as it melts, it goes through a whole change of shape. Eventually, it's going to become a liquid. So it wouldn't look anything like the same shape as the original. And so as we see it change, well, we see it change, but that's our senses once again. And it's telling us that the thing that appears solid in one moment could be liquid in another moment. So how do we declare it to be the same? It's obviously not the same physically. It's changed its state. So Descartes is heading toward a different direction. And Emily was on I think, Descartes' track by suggesting that it's our memory that allows us to identify it as the same. That's not exactly what Descartes says, but it's getting close. So let me turn the page again. I want to keep you in suspense all day. Let's turn the page and see exactly what Descartes has to say about it. Okay, and I'll now come back to you with that page. All right. And you can also see this new page, right? So he says, I never had a sensory grasp of what the wax is. In other words, the wax through his senses was just a sum total of shape, odor, color, texture, and so forth. But all that could be changed just by moving it closer to the fire or further from the fire. All the information from the senses is susceptible to change. So it can't be the senses which allows him to conclude that this is the same piece of wax. But all of you, like Descartes, and like me too, would want to say it's the same piece of wax. Of course, you could always take another version of this argument, conclude a different way. You could always say, well, no, it's not the same piece of wax. I mean, but that's a different argument. Let's stay with Descartes. How could he know it's the same piece of wax? How can he possibly know? His answer is, and it's in that highlighted paragraph on the right-hand side, very important. He says, now, he says, I have brought myself back to where I wanted to be. I now know that physical objects are not really known through sensation or imagination even, but are grasped by the understanding alone. So, Emily, you were very close. Descartes wants to say that we know that wax is the same piece of wax because of our understanding. Now, you might want to assert that memory plays a role in understanding. And I would agree with you that if we try to understand things that are very complex, we're going to need our memory as well. But Descartes is talking about, in this case, his focus is on this faculty of mind. He's calling it a faculty of mind called understanding. Yeah. And that's how we know, for Descartes, that this wax is the same piece of wax because of our understanding, but not because of our senses. Are you clear? This leads to a very interesting discussion, and we're going to go there. But I just want to first make sure you're clear about Descartes' line of reasoning. Are you clear about his conclusion? Yeah? Okay, so he's saying it's because of our understanding, this mysterious thing called understanding. And that's the word I wanted to focus on. It's a very interesting word, and I'm going to look at least at two dimensions of it with you. We're going to expand now what Descartes is trying to tell us into a couple of different directions, which are both really dependent on this notion of understanding. First of all, do you guys, let's say, are you able on a given day or at a given moment to know whether you understand something or not? Like if I said to you, do you understand this? Whatever it may be, you'd be able to say yes or no, right? Sometimes, yes, I know, Mohammed, you're being careful. In a philosophy course, it's always good to be careful. I know, no, don't be too hasty. Sometimes, okay, but if I said to you in general, you know, let's say I started speaking a language other than English. Let's say, for the sake of argument, I started speaking in a language other than English, and I asked you if you understood that language. You would either understand it or not, right? Or partly, maybe you'd recognize some words, like Mohammed maybe saying, maybe I'd recognize the odd word, but maybe I wouldn't recognize the whole sentence. But basically, you guys if somebody asks you how many languages you understand, you could say so, can't you? Of course you can. Of course you can. And if someone's speaking to you in a language you understand, you know that you understand it, right? You don't have to ask yourself whether you understand it. If someone's speaking to you in a language that you don't understand, you also know, wait a second, I don't understand what they're saying. Why? Because I don't understand this language. Yeah? Okay, clearly. So in a given, you know, like if you're traveling in a foreign country, like I do sometimes, and when we used to travel in the good old days and turn on the TV, you know, if I'm in a country whose language I don't speak, I turn on the TV and immediately I'm saying to myself, gee, I wish I understood this language, but I know that I don't, okay? I don't understand anything that they're saying. All right. So it's because we can distinguish normally whether we actually understand something or not. And in some cases it may be more difficult, but most of the time you could say whether you understand something or not. Now, have you ever had this experience? And Ramon says, if you can teach it, you understand it. Well, Ramon, thank you for being so charitable. That's usually true. Hopefully your teachers understand what they're teaching you, but I have to say that there are some subjects where you can't even take that for granted. Please keep your sense of humor as active, okay, when I say this, but philosophy is one of those subjects where we very often can teach things without really necessarily understanding them. And I'm giving you this case in point right now. We're talking about understanding, and I'm sure that while you know whether you understand something or not, I'm not so clear that any of us understands what understanding is itself. Think about that. For example, maybe I can teach you something about philosophy, and another teacher could teach you something about geography, or English, or science, or whatever you're studying, right? So people can teach subjects or subject matter. Is there a course called Understanding 101? Yeah, I wish, me too, but there isn't. No, of course, Ibrahim, there's no such course, because we can't teach understanding. We can only teach content, and we can hope that through your reading and your reflection, and perhaps our teaching, that this content will be understandable to you. Yes, you'll be able to somehow take it in and process it. Understanding is a learned behavior. Well, I don't know if it's a behavior. Because it seems to me, I mean, it depends what you mean by behavior, but when we try and understand something, we're doing it internally. Descartes' point is that it's work that the mind is doing, so it's hard to observe. But I think you can observe it in yourselves in that sense. Have you all, anyone, and I hope that you've all had the experience where maybe you're struggling to understand something, maybe it's a math problem, or physics problem or something, and it's really, you're really struggling, and suddenly, it could be anything, but suddenly you understand it. And then it's like a light comes on. Have you had that experience where suddenly, now I get this, right? We usually say get. Oh, now I get it. Right, now I get it. Yes. So you've all had this experience where you were working on trying to understand something, and it may have been difficult or challenging, and then suddenly there's this breakthrough moment, right? It happens often when we learn that there's a breakthrough moment where, oh, now I get it. Meaning suddenly it's like the light of understanding has come on in your own mind. And that is what Descartes means by understanding. So understanding is work that you have to do internally in a certain way with your mind. And then you will know, presumably, if you've understood something or not. Sometimes we can also misunderstand with human beings. By the way, this is a third possibility. Descartes' not dealing with it here, but I'm just mentioning it for the sake of enrichment and maybe to confuse you further. But isn't it also true that sometimes we actually think we understand something when we don't? Or somebody says something to us, and we think they meant something, but they actually meant something else. Yes? Okay, you all agree, right? So somebody could say something to you, and you might misunderstand what they say, yeah, or misunderstand what they mean, right? That happens all the time. And misunderstanding is a problem often because it means it's like a failure in communication. If someone misunderstands, it can be bad. But misunderstanding is where we think we understand, but we've understood in the wrong way, or we've understood something other than what was being conveyed to us. So there's that other possibility that we can actually deceive ourselves in a certain sense by misunderstanding. But Descartes not talking about that. And then Muhammad makes a comment, philosophical understanding is different, depends on how the philosopher defines it. Yeah, I would go along with that, Muhammad, and I would say to you that that this is why philosophy is partly is interesting for us, because it's not like math. I would say that if you understand, let's take an example of Pythagoras' theorem, okay? If you understand some basic mathematical concept, let's say geometry, and Pythagoras' theorem that in a right triangle, the length of the hypotenuse is the square root of the sum of the squares of the other two sides. That's a very famous theorem from a long time ago. Pythagoras, 600 BC, is credited with that theorem. So everybody who studies geometry and who understands the Pythagorean theorem probably understands it in pretty much the same way. Similarly, if you're doing just factual things like recitations of facts, okay, we all know that, again, Albany is the capital of New York State, and we probably all understand that in a pretty similar way. Whether we've been to Albany or not, we understand the concept of the capital of a state, and we understand the name of New York's capital being Albany. So I think that kind of fact is understandable in the same way. Many things are. But when we come to philosophy, I agree with you 100% that philosophical understanding is not going to be the same for every philosopher. And even when you read a text, each of you may understand it in a slightly different way, because it's not like mathematics. It's not self-interpreting. It's not like logic, where it's pretty much self-interpreting. You follow the steps and then you understand it. Philosophy is a subject which is much more elastic, both in what philosophers are saying and also in terms of how we ourselves decide to interpret what they're saying. So it is certainly a subject that lends itself to much interpretation. And in that sense, it will also lend itself to different ways of understanding. And that's why we assign essays to you. Because, hey, if everyone were going to write the same essay on Descartes, it would make no sense to assign it. But since you're all going to take away maybe a little bit of a different conception of what Descartes is saying, then it will make it interesting to hear your interpretation, right? And no two essays will resemble each other identically. And that's why philosophy is different. And I'll just add to that, Mohammed, there's another subject which is similar to this. If you study modern physics, you're going to get to the same place. If you study older physics, traditional physics, classical physics, like Newton's laws are Newton's laws, and they're all understood in the same way, pretty much. If you do Physics 101, and I have, and I'm sure that almost every Physics 101 professor is going to teach Newton's laws in the same way and understand them in pretty much the same way. And this will be true of, let's say, calculus or any other subject. When you get to more advanced physics, if you get to special relativity or general relativity or quantum theory, then our understanding of those subjects becomes much more susceptible to interpretation. Excuse me for 1 second. That's robocalls. I got most of them suppressed, but not all of them. And I'm trying to turn it off, but it's not letting me. It's very irritating, very irritating, very irritating. And I can't control that. I need my phone. So sorry about that. Yeah, physics is like this because modern physics becomes very philosophical when we start asking ourselves, oh, what does it mean? You know, what does it really mean? What's reality really like? Astronomical physics, yes, if you mean astronomy or cosmology and our understanding of the universe, it's a much stranger place than we had thought, yeah? So it's a subject when you take advanced courses, then very much your understanding of quantum mechanics may be different than your fellow students' understanding, and every professor may teach it in a slightly different way according to their understanding also. So that could definitely be a different factor, all right? So I think that's quite true. But for basic things like the candle and what's happening to the candle when we pick it up from the desk and move it toward the fire, Descartes says we know it's the same piece of wax because of our understanding and not because of anything that our senses told us. Our senses will give us different information at different stages along the way and make it seem like it's a different piece of wax. But actually, our understanding is telling us that it is the same piece of wax. And please understand that what he means by understanding is nothing physical. For him, that ability that we have to understand is, in fact, an ability of the mind. Okay, it's called a faculty of the mind. Note the word faculty being used. When we talk about physical things, we talk about parts, right? Faculty of the mind. If we're talking about the brain, we don't talk, about faculties of the brain. We talk about parts of the brain, like we can talk about the anatomy of the brain, yes? If you look at a textbook or a medical textbook, which shows a slice of the brain or a diagram of the brain, you're going to have the temporal lobes and the, and the parietal lobes and the hypothalamus and all, the rhinencephalus and all the, you see the parts, right? Like we'll say parts of the brain, yeah? Parts of the, well, we can talk about parts, like talking about parts of the car, right? Parts of the brain, body, right? We talk about our body parts. We're talking about organs that we transplant. We're talking about parts, but we don't talk about parts of the mind. We talk about faculties of the mind. That's different than parts of the body, right? This is, once again, Descartes' dualism, right? Faculties of the mind are mental things. They're not physical things. Parts of the body or parts of the brain are physical things. Faculties of the mind are non-physical things, and understanding is a non-physical faculty of the mind. Clear? Everybody good with this? Okay, good. Good. And that's also probably why university professors were called faculty, right? I mean, the university is a physical place, but it's also primarily a place where we think, and on a good day. So we're thinking, and we're charged with helping to encourage that. So faculty is the name for us, and that probably has something to do with this Cartesian distinction between parts of bodies and faculties of minds. And so understanding is a faculty of your mind. Now, let me provoke you a little further in the remaining time. I want to now look at a modern case through, let's say, Descartes' lens and see if it makes sense to you. I think it's a very interesting case. It's a case of Helen Keller. And everybody knows who she was, I'm assuming. I'll type her name. Anyone heard of her? Yeah, right. Okay, good. Many of you have. Some of you haven't. That's all right. I'll just explain briefly. Okay, good. Where, by the way, just what was the context? I'm curious. How did you hear about Helen Keller? How do you know about her?
Isn't she a singer that's like new?
You learned about her in reading class. Some of you. Okay, that's good. Middle school. Oh, you mentioned, oh, they mentioned her in middle school play, history. Okay. Yeah, she comes up in back in middle school. All right. So she came up way back then. That's fine. That's very good. For those of you who don't know, 5th grade social studies. Wow. Okay. Elementary school. We're getting even earlier in life. You heard about her way back in elementary school. That's amazing. Okay. Helen Keller, as many of you may know, was both deaf and blind as a child. Congenitally, she was deaf and blind, and she eventually not only learned to speak English, but also spoke very well and wrote. So she was able to write her memoirs and write different things. So she's quite an inspiring figure. And what's really fascinating is this question of how did she ever learn English? I mean, or whatever, could have been any language, but she grew up in the U.S. So here's a child who could neither hear nor see. Imagine if you had at home a child who could neither, a baby, who could neither hear nor see. How would you possibly be able to teach, or how would that child possibly be able to learn a language without being able to hear anything and without being able to see anything? Isn't that an incredible challenge? And Keith immediately jumps on this field. Yeah, well, that's part of the story. And I'll just briefly tell you the story. With what senses she did have. Well, this is where we're going to start to see what the context or the relevance is to Descartes. Emily says with what senses she did have. Well, right, minus hearing and sight, you're still left with taste, touch, and smell, right? So you can still feel, you can still taste, and you can still smell things. All right, but how does that end up conveying language to you? I mean, that's not so easy. Mohammed says vibrations. Yeah, do you know that it often happens because of the adaptability of our brains, I guess, that when people lose a sense or people are missing one of their 5 senses, that the other senses will often, some of the other senses will often become strengthened in order to compensate for the loss of the particular sense, right? Other senses will sometimes become quite heightened in people. So, for example, people who are sightless, people who can't see, will often, not always, but often develop better hearing. and more acute hearing, and also sense of touch, particularly if they're reading Braille. They need to be able to hone that sense of touch more than the average person. So yeah, that's what happens. I mean, it's our way of navigating the world. It's a very important capacity. And the sense of, you said vibrations, you know, I just want to digress to tell you that there's at least one person who is deaf, who plays viola in a symphony orchestra. There's a woman, I don't remember who, in the U.S. She can't hear anything, but she plays viola in a symphony orchestra, and yet she's deaf. This is incredible, right? Absolutely incredible. But she does it, and she does it through vibration. She's able to tune her viola. You can do that. You don't have to hear anything to tune an instrument. You need to be able to feel vibrations of a tuning fork and a tuning. You know, now they have digital tuners. You don't have to hear anything. The digital tuner does all the work. So she can tune her viola, and then she can sit with the viola. Of course, she's an excellent musician, right? So her intonation is perfect, and her sight reading is perfect, and all of that. And she sits with the violas, and she's watching the conductor, and she knows when they're starting. She reads the music. She knows when to play, when not to play. She's following the conductor. No problem there. But she says she hears all the other instruments through only vibration, but she can still feel the orchestra through her sense of touch. In other words, her sense of vibration. That's incredible. I mean, that's truly incredible. So it's possible to do that. All right. It's possible, therefore, to be an accomplished musician without hearing anything. It is amazing, but it goes back to Descartes. So if you say, well, she couldn't hear anything, how can she possibly be playing viola? It's partly because she could feel vibrations, but Descartes would say it's primarily because she understands music. And it's not got to do with her senses, but through her understanding of music. Beethoven was deaf in the latter part of his career. And in fact, it was only discovered by accident. If you're a composer, my friends, and you're earning a living composing music, you certainly don't want people to find out that you're deaf, right? This could be a liability. I mean, people might not want to commission you to write music if they knew you couldn't hear music anymore. So apparently Beethoven disguised the fact, and it only emerged by accident one day. He was rehearsing with an orchestra, and he was very engrossed in the music because he had written it, and he was very engrossed in, and the orchestra, for one reason or another, they all stopped playing, and Beethoven didn't notice. So Beethoven was studying the score and wildly conducting, you know, and like nobody was playing, and there's Beethoven is wildly conducting the orchestra, but they'd all stopped. And then people realized this guy can't hear anything, or he wouldn't be conducting us when we weren't playing anymore. And then they found out. But Beethoven had this ability to compose music. I mean, compose brilliant music that's still played today, and he couldn't hear a note. And how are you going to account for this? Descartes' going to say it's because he heard it where? In his understanding, in his mind, right? He had some ability, a tremendous ability, to be able to hear music. And also to remember it, back to memory, what Emily was saying, I think, earlier. Sure, I mean, not only does he have to be able to hear, but he has to be able in his mind, right? But he has to be able to remember what he's hearing in his mind. Of course, that's facilitated by writing it down, yeah? You can write the music. As you're hearing it in your mind, you can write the score, and that enables you not to have to remember it, and it enables other people also to play it. So memory works, though. I mean, musicians rely a lot on memory. Soloists with orchestras are not reading music, yeah? Everybody in the orchestra is reading music, so they don't need to remember, although they do mostly. The score is just to help them focus. But soloists are not reading a score. They're doing everything from memory. Incredible that they can do this. We can do this. Okay, back to Helen Keller. So here's a child who's very young, and she's not able to hear, she's not able to see. And how she learned language is the following. And according to her own, she actually tells the story. And so does her caretaker, because she was too young to remember this. But her caretaker remembers it. And then she's able to confirm the caretaker's story. She had this very, very kind and compassionate caretaker named Anne Sullivan. And Anne Sullivan writes that one day, she was trying to communicate with her, you know, and it was very, very difficult because she couldn't hear or see. I mean, she could feel. So Anne Sullivan was trying to communicate to her that things had names. All these things that she could pick up and play with had names. And she was trying to communicate that. So she had her two hands. Here's Helen Keller with the two hands out like this, palms up, right? And Anne Sullivan said she's pouring water on one palm, so Helen can feel kind of the sensation of water on this hand, and on the other hand, Anne Sullivan is tracing the shape of a W, just tracing over and over again a W shape, because W, of course, is the first letter of the word water, right? So she's pouring water here. So Helen Keller has a sensation of water, wetness of water on this one palm. On the other palm, at the same time, is being traced the shape of a W. And Helen Keller said, and in her own words, that she suddenly understood, that's Descartes' word, she suddenly understood that the name of the sensation on one hand, the name of the sensation of water, was being described by this shape that was being traced on her other hand. She understood, therefore, that this sensation had a name. And that was the beginning of her linguistic breakthrough. Of course, this was not the end of the story. It's a very long story. The acquisition of sophisticated language took many, many, many steps. But this was the initial breakthrough, because she then said she wanted to know the name of everything. The understanding was that every sensation that she was experiencing had a name. And that could not have come to her. Descartes is going to say to you, aha. He's going to say, right, if Descartes could come back to life and read and know that story, he'd say, there you go. She understood that every sensation has a name. And that came from her mind. That understanding was not triggered by any specific sensation. It was rather a greater and deeper understanding, a more profound understanding of her mind, that sensations have names, and that, in fact, all things that we can feel have names. And then Helen somehow began to learn the names of these things by having them traced on her hand. So she learned the alphabet by having it traced on her hand. How she went from there to pronouncing words is a whole other story, and I'm not familiar with it. That's another kind of breakthrough, right? To translate that understanding back into speech and to be able to hear, to speak a language that one can't hear is truly incredible. But all of this is attributed to her understanding. And if you go back to more contemporary research on this, on cognitive development, and or maybe Chomsky's theory of innate grammar, it seems that the brain already has in it, that nowadays they say brain, but Descartes would say, no, we're talking about the mind, that we're already born with the ability to learn a language. It doesn't really matter which one we're exposed to, because more fundamental than that is the ability to learn a language. And any baby, as you probably well realize, any baby, newborn baby from any culture at all, would learn the language it's first exposed to, right? If you start transplanting babies born in one culture and transplant them into some other culture where they speak a different language, the baby's going to learn the language it's exposed to, right? It doesn't know what language its parents speak. It's only going to learn the language it's exposed to. So we all have this capacity, and Descartes would say we are born with the capacity to understand language. And the actual language we pick up, of course, depends on our senses. That depends on what we hear and what we repeat. But the actual capacity to do it is not a sense. The capacity to do with it, the capacity to acquire a language, is a faculty of mind. And understanding is how we actually utilize language. So that's a kind of an argument that supports the rationalist account of knowledge, right? That we learn by understanding. Is this clear? Yes, okay. Any questions about this? Yeah, it is pretty amazing, I think. Good, okay, everyone seems to be clear. I'm glad. That's the name of the game here. We want to get clarity where we can. Not everything that we study this term will be clear or clarifiable. And as I say from the beginning, we're all saying yes because it makes sense. I think this account does make sense. Now, I'll just to tip next week, the empiricist is still going to have a little bit of wiggle room. The empiricist gets the thin end of the wedge into this argument, and we'll see one next week when we look at Berkeley. But remember, she still had to have this understanding triggered by something, right? So what triggered her understanding? that things have names? What was it that triggered the understanding? Some of you said this earlier on when we talked about her in the first place. Something had to trigger this capacity to understand that things have names. So what was the actual trigger? The understanding may well be what Descartes says. It's a mental faculty. But what triggered it? The senses, yes. So the empiricist will say to René Descartes, yeah, even if her understanding was taking place in the mind, and that's probably, a big chunk of it, but it still had to be activated, right, Sophina? Like the understanding may have been latent or dormant, but how did it get activated? It was only activated, the empiricist will say, it was only activated by her sense of touch. When she could feel the water on one hand and feel the W on the other hand, that activated her understanding. So the empiricist will object to Descartes and say, typically, if Helen Keller had been in a sensory deprivation chamber where she couldn't have felt anything either, her understanding never would have been activated. So the empiricist is going to say that we still need the senses for something. We still need the senses for something. But Descartes will say, yeah, but it's less important how specifically the senses activated her capacity to speak. It's the fact that she understands language that allows her to read, to write, to read Braille nowadays. I guess we do that, and to write and to speak the language. That's still her understanding and not the work of her senses. And when we look at computers, which understand language, fast forward to what's coming later in this section of the course, well, we can communicate with, Google Translate is able to quote unquote understand to a certain extent, right? We can type a phrase or a sentence into Google Translate in one language and it will spit out a translation in another language. And then it becomes a really interesting question for us later on. Does Google Translate understand those languages? And does it have any sense? What sense is it using to input that? Well, this is a big question for us, because this term understanding is not going to go away, folks. It's going to play a vital role in our further explorations of what it means to know things and understand itself. That, like the Chinese room, exactly. We'll come to that, Abraham. I'm glad you know about this already. We'll come to this. That's our last reading in this section, is the Chinese room. So hang on to your hats. Okay, so anyway, that's enough of Descartes and this very important focus on the notion of understanding and the role that plays in our knowledge and our certain knowledge, if there's any. I want to give you a quick preview of the reading for next day. I'm not going to start it with you. I'm just going to put a screen so you can see it, and you'll know, therefore, what to look for. Let me stop sharing this screen. Let me figure out how to do that. Okay. Hello again. I'll come back and just briefly put up the next reading so you'll make no mistake in identifying it. And it's here. Okay. So next week, we're going to be looking at this very interesting and important dialogue. And you're asking Melody already, how far should we read into the first reading? Well, let me answer you in a philosophical way. How long is a piece of string? I would say that officially, it's a good question. Officially, we are only going to read the first dialogue together, not all three. Okay, so there are three dialogues that come bundled. And we're going to look only at the first one. So I would say, please read the first dialogue. And we're going to spend 2 lectures next week, both Monday's lecture and next Thursday's lecture here on Blackboard. We'll be reading the first dialogue by Berkeley and discussing it. So that's as far as you need to go. If you're interested enough in this to go further, go. You're more than welcome. So this is it. It's in your Google Drive folder. It's called Three Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. And when you give the first essay prompt, the essay questions are already up there in your Google Drive folder. If you look in the supplementary materials for the first section, you will find the essay questions. I'm not giving you due dates yet. We have to cover 5 readings. I'll give you due dates about 2 weeks before the due date. Okay, but you'll see them. This is what I want you guys to read. at least the first half of it, or if not all of the first dialogue between now and Monday. We're going to cover the first dialogue next week. Not all three, but the first one. It's called, they're called dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, in opposition to skeptics and atheists. Note, in opposition. All right. Now, Descartes is definitely a skeptic, right? We know this. He says it himself. So Berkeley is partly responding to Descartes. It's also in opposition to atheists. Now, Descartes is not an atheist, so Berkeley and Descartes actually both believe in God. They have that in common. But Descartes is a radical rationalist, and Berkeley is a radical empiricist. So definitely Berkeley is going to reply to Descartes' skepticism in his own way. And the two characters in the dialogue are Hylas and Philonous. They're Greek names, and Hylas means matter, like material, stuff, substance, yeah? So Hylas is a materialist. He believes in the material world. And Philonous in Greek means love of mind, love of mind. And that's Berkeley in the dialogue. But Berkeley's an empiricist, not a rationalist. So Berkeley's idea of the work the mind is doing is going to be informed by empiricism more than rationalism, at least initially. Although, again, there will be some overlap with Descartes. But you can start reading it. Berkeley is absolutely shocking. If you understand by the end of the first dialogue next week, if you really understand what Berkeley is saying, you'll never look at the world the same way again, I promise. But you don't have to believe him. But try and understand what he's saying. It's truly shocking. Okay, there's no such thing as reality. It's all in the mind. All in the mind. And so, but it's only known through the senses, and no other way. So anyway, we'll get to Berkeley next week. I want you to all have a very good weekend. Okay, very happy, very safe holiday. And I'll look forward to seeing everybody on Monday morning on Zoom, right? We're back to Zoom Monday. You're welcome. You're welcome, everybody. And I'll look forward to seeing you, if not live Monday, then watch the recording. And we'll be back here, same time, same station on Thursday. All right? Take care, everybody. I'm stopping the recording now. See you then. Be well. Bye-bye. And read Berkeley, okay? So long.